Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. This week, the Department of Homeland Security decided to end temporary protective status for 200,000 Salvadoran immigrants who had originally been granted the special status due to a devastating earthquake in 2001. The administration claims that now that El Salvador has repaired the damage, the program has run its course and has given the immigrants in question 18 months to sort out their affairs. Some are expected to remain in the country through other legal means, some are expected to remain illegally, and some are expected to return to El Salvador. But the move has been controversial, with many immigrant advocacy groups and Democrats claiming it will harm the U.S. economy and split apart families. Supporters of the policy change counter that it is merely a fulfillment of the original terms and conditions of the program. Was this the correct decision on the part of the Trump administration? What will be the consequences for the United States? And how does this play into the larger question of how to reform our immigration policy? The TPS program, or Temporary Protected Status Program, it's something that's been granted to around a dozen countries in the past couple of decades. Those countries include Sudan, South Sudan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Yemen. El Salvador has been one of the largest beneficiaries of the program. It's been estimated that 260,000 Salvadorans in total have been granted this status. The Trump administration has already ended the TPS program for Haiti and Nicaragua. Just 60,000 Haitian immigrants had received this status after the devastating 2010 earthquake, and 2,500 Nicaraguan immigrants received the status after a 1998 hurricane. The Democratic Party has come out against this move. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, for example, said, "Ending TPS for El Salvador will have devastating impacts by tearing families apart. These petitions reaffirm our D.C. values, and we will continue fighting for our neighbors." While California Representative Jimmy Panetta said, "Tomorrow is the deadline to extend TPS for 200,000 Salvadorans. They own businesses and homes and pay taxes. Without them, the U.S. would lose billions from GDP, Social Security, and Medicare, and employers would pay millions in turnover costs." I don't put much stock in these arguments. By that same argument, doing anything to restrict immigration by any group seeking to enter the U.S. would be disastrous for our economy. Basically, the argument that Congressman Panetta is making here is just that we're going to lose population, so there are going to be less people paying into Social Security and Medicare, and our GDP is going to go down. Well, fair enough, that may be true, but population growth is a serious concern. We're at 330 million people now, and really, if you look at the overall picture, the environmental picture, the transportation picture, the infrastructure picture, the housing picture, education, everything, sure, you can make an argument that we need more people here so we have a higher GDP. I would make an argument that we need fewer people here so we can have a higher quality of life. Our cities and suburban areas are already congested, our schools are congested, our emergency rooms and hospitals are congested. I mean, the bottom line here is the Democratic Party is very, very disproportionately favored by immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants. They want their votes. Democrats want mass immigration because they want to turn immigrants into loyal, reliable Democratic voters. And Republicans want massive immigration because they want to exploit the cheap labor that goes along with it. The majority of these Salvadorians currently are living in California, Texas, and Virginia. And the New York Times has a great piece on it. The New York Times, in its article, makes the best case for not extending these benefits, in my mind. The article says, and despite its name, the administration says, the Temporary Protected Status Program has turned into a quasi-permanent benefit for hundreds of thousands of people. The Department of Homeland Security said that because damaged roads, schools, hospitals, homes, and water systems have been reconstructed since the earthquakes, the Salvadorans no longer belonged in the program. And the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security said, based on careful consideration of available information, the Secretary determined that the original conditions caused by the 2001 earthquakes no longer exist. Thus, under the applicable statute, the current TPS designation must be terminated. So the key criterion here is whether the original conditions that created the TPS status still exist. The program is working exactly as it should. And the U.S. Is getting a lot of flack now, pushback against the Trump administration and so forth. I would like to highlight the generosity of the United States in implementing this program in the first place. The United States and France consistently take in more refugees than anyone else in the world. We are very welcoming to immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, but it's got to be done with rules and it's got to be done with regulations. And this was designed as a temporary measure. It's already been in place for 17 years, and this program can't just go on indefinitely. And I think you can make a very good argument that these people should return to their home country and bring their talents and skills and investments with them. They now presumably speak English. I saw one study that 85% of them speak conversational or basic English, and 45% speak fluent English. They've had access to our public education system. They've had years or decades to save up money. They can go back and start businesses and help with the process of turning their country around. I mean, a temporary program is just that. The New York Times article interviews a woman in California named Veronica Lagunas, who says there is nothing to go back to in El Salvador. The infrastructure may be better now, but the country is in no condition to receive us. Well, instead of being angry at Trump for rescinding the status, why not be grateful to the U.S. for taking in 200,000 Salvadorians, including many who had come to the country illegally to begin with? Does someone like Veronica Lagunas ever consider that she could play a pivotal role, or that she even has a responsibility to play a pivotal role in rebuilding El Salvador? Or is she mainly focused on her own economic well-being? I spent a fair amount of time in El Salvador in 2014, and as someone who spends a lot of time living in Bogota, Colombia, the parallels between San Salvador and Bogota were striking. You need to be careful. No, it's not as safe as a major city in the United States. It's not as safe as a New York or a Chicago or a Miami or a Los Angeles. But the idea that this program was set up to take a huge chunk of people, 250,000 people from El Salvador, and bring them to the United States and give them citizenship, that is exactly not what the program was set up to do. The program was set up to provide them a temporary place of refuge and safety while their country was being rebuilt. Millions and millions of dollars of international aid poured in to El Salvador. The damage from these earthquakes has been repaired, and now it's time to go back. They are not Americans. They are Salvadorans. And regardless of whether they speak English or regardless of whether they pledge allegiance to the American flag or prefer to live in the United States, they are Salvadorans. And the United States cannot be taking in hundreds of thousands or millions of refugees permanently just because there are circumstances in those countries that are problematic. And furthermore, the biggest problem I have, I don't mind, there should be some kind of meritocracy. Perhaps some could stay, perhaps 20 or 30 or 40 or 50,000 could stay. I would have no problem with that. But what I have a serious problem with is this policy provided incentives for illegal immigrants from El Salvador to enter the U.S., even if they were not affected at all by the hurricane. And it's been repeatedly demonstrated that there is so much fraud and abuse in these programs. It's almost impossible to actually verify that these people were actually affected by the hurricane. And even more troubling, this program rewarded Salvadorans who had already broken the law by coming to the U.S. illegally. So basically what the program did was say, okay, we have Salvadoran immigrants who are in the United States illegally. Oh, there was just a earthquake, so let's find a way to give them temporary work status and residency in the United States. It's not a green card, it's not a permanent residency, and it's not a path to citizenship. Even the Democrats are not suggesting that that was what the program originally was. But the potential for fraud and abuse in such a program is astounding, and we have to recognize that. I would like to see a study done at a major American research university as to exactly how many of these 260,000 Salvadoran immigrants were not affected by the earthquake. I mean, free from the dictates of political correctness. Really, it's very difficult to verify these people's stories. I mean, they show up in the U.S. and say, we were devastated by an earthquake. Well, how do you prove that? Were we actually sending investigative teams to the United States? Was the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador investigating these claims? I mean, it's like when illegal immigrants enter the United States, they're caught, all they have to do is say that we felt a credible threat from a drug cartel or from some kind of criminal gang. I mean, clearly these kinds of abuses have to end. And I don't care if you're a liberal, a conservative, a libertarian, a socialist, a Republican, a Democrat, the potential for abuse here is astounding. I mean, there's no verification system in place. And there is a big economic impact on both sides of the border here. The economic impact is quite large in El Salvador. In 2016, for example, Salvadorans sent $4.6 billion in remittances to their home country. That accounted for 17%. That's 1/6 of the Salvadoran economy. So these are big numbers here. The Salvadoran government clearly wants these people to stay, so they keep sending back remittances. But there's another side to this argument, and that is that why don't these people, on both sides of the border, in El Salvador and the United States, why isn't anyone making the argument that these people have a responsibility to go back and help to rebuild their own country? They're not Americans. They're Salvadorans. And they should take their skills and talents back, start a business, go to work in a school, go to work in a hospital, build a new home. The idea that the solution to all the world's problems is for the United States to take in 250,000 or 500,000 refugees or immigrants, that is rather preposterous. Now, it hasn't been just Democrats that have opposed the policy change. There have also been Republicans who have opposed the policy change. Florida Representative Mario Diaz-Balart said, for example, these innocent people fled their home country after a disastrous earthquake, and while living conditions may have slightly improved, El Salvador now faces a significant problem with drug trafficking, gangs, and crime. Since 2001, these people have established themselves in the United States, making countless contributions to our society and our local communities. It would be devastating to send them home after they have created a humble living for themselves and their families. Well, why would it be devastating? This is not Somalia or Yemen or Iraq. This is El Salvador. Yes, there is some danger, but this is ultimately the responsibility of the Salvadoran government and the Salvadoran people. We, the United States and the international community, can do what they can, but we cannot single-handedly get violent, ruthless street gangs like MS-13, which runs some parts of urban areas in El Salvador, under control. That is the responsibility of the Salvadoran military, of the Salvadoran police, and the Salvadoran government. And has anyone actually done a cost-benefit analysis on the economic impact of having 250,000 Salvadorans in the country? Would concerns over political correctness even allow such a study to be done? This is the kind of thing that we should be doing. This is the kind of thing that we should be doing to form our public policy. And yes, they are paying some taxes, they are contributing to Medicare and Social Security, but what they are costing, without question or doubt, what they are costing the United States government and state and local municipal governments vastly outweighs any contributions they're making to Medicare and Social Security. I mean, these are people, by and large, who came to the United States low-skilled and did not speak English. I realize that there are exceptions. Some came with high levels of skills and did speak English, but by and large, these people are costing the United States far more than they're contributing. I mean, that's the biggest problem of all. And as Milton Friedman said, you cannot combine open borders and a welfare state. So the idea that we're going to tank the U.S. economy if we end this program, which by its very definition is temporary, the temporary protective status, no one in the Democratic Party seems to remember that, is really preposterous. No, we do not need these. We do not need 250,000 Salvadorans in the United States in order to run our economy. What should be done, and what I'd very much support, there should be a quota for, say, some kind of meritocracy-based system. If 50,000 of these Salvadorans are essential in the labor force and they have employers who are going to advocate for them, go to bat for them, get them a green card, well, I'm all in favor of that. I'm anti-illegal immigration. I'm not anti-legal immigration. It just needs to be legal immigrants in the United States should be people who are here to work and or study and who are not here to drain the coffers of the United States Treasury, collect benefits. We cannot afford to do that, especially as we're $20 trillion in debt. The United States is not the world's daycare center. We're not here to take in hundreds of thousands or millions of people every time there's a conflict. We do what we can, and in fact, we are very generous when it comes to this, but everything needs to have its limits, and everything needs to have a budget and a number associated with it. You know, contrast what we do with Canada. We take in far more refugees and immigrants than Canada does. Canada handpicks its refugees and immigrants and has virtually no illegal immigration arriving by land or by sea. But there are actually people on the left of the spectrum who think that Canada is some paradise, some incredibly generous and wonderful country to refugees and immigrants. We do far more for refugees and immigrants than Canada does. And what Canada does is allow immigration if you're going to come there with money. If you're going to come there with money and skills and actually contribute it to the economy and contribute more into the system than you take out of the system, sure, Canada loves to have you there. But the idea that Canada is just taking in the same numbers that we are, low-skill refugees and immigrants is preposterous. And finally, to wrap things up here, there's an interesting parallel with this case in something that happened at Harvard University about a decade ago. There was a Tulane student all set to go to Tulane University when Hurricane Katrina rolled through, I believe, 2005. So Harvard University took her in for a year and said that she could study there, but it was a temporary program. Tulane had said, we'll be up and running next year, so every Tulane student had to go somewhere else to study. So this girl went to Harvard University, and at the end of her year, she applied to remain, and the university said no, and she started a petition and got all of her friends and started this big campaign and so forth to remain at Harvard, and said, well, I have my friends here. It's the only academic world I've known. It's the only social world I've known. It would be very unfair to send me back to Tulane. But at the end of the day, Harvard University said, no, this was a temporary program. We told you the terms and conditions when we took you in for a year. Now that Tulane University is up and running, you have to go back. So the idea that Republicans or Trump or the DHS is cold and heartless on this matter, I don't buy that at all. I mean, they're just as heartless and cold as Harvard University was when they said a student who entered a temporary program and then would have to go back to the place that she originally was accepted. There is no right for citizens of another country, for foreign nationals of another country, to come to the United States, and there's no right for them to stay here. They came under the auspices of a temporary program, a temporary protective status program. It is time for them to go back to El Salvador, at least the vast majority of them. I have, again, like I've said before, I have no problems with some staying for the right economic reasons, but Trump is making the right move here, and the Department of Homeland Security is making the right move here. And we really need to do less and less of this type of thing, and if we are extending TPS programs to countries, we need to make it very clear in our public policy and make it very clear to the Democratic and Republican parties that this is indeed temporary. Thanks for listening. This has been David Unsworth with the PanAm Post English podcast, and please be so kind as to subscribe to our YouTube channel.